Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of About Abroad, where it's my job to introduce you to people who have built amazing lives for themselves in various foreign corners of the globe. We're talking with expats and thought leaders about moving abroad, remote work, visas, and all the fun and practical knowledge that you need to know to follow in their footsteps. If you've ever dreamed of making a life for yourself overseas, maybe working remotely or embracing long-term travel, retiring or studying abroad, or even just taking a peek inside life beyond your borders, you've landed in the right place. My guest today is my good friend Darren Murph, who probably needs no introduction for many of you. He is very likely the top voice in the remote work, future of work space, someone who many of us look up to and have learned a lot from over the years. He literally wrote the handbook on building remote teams while he was at GitLab and is currently the vice president of workplace design and remote experience at Andela. He's also a Guinness World Record holding storyteller, a startup advisor, a speaker, and many other things in his identity stack, which we dive into today. One particular element that I was really interested in learning more about is his experience as a world traveler, first as an individual, then as a couple, and now as a family man with his son, Mav. So we get into all of this, as well as some of our experiences and takeaways from our time together in Lisbon recently, where we were there for running remote and learned a lot from some of the top thought leaders in the remote workspace. A lot packed into this one. I absolutely loved it and hope you all will as well. Please help me in welcoming Darren Murph to About Abroad. You know, the funny thing is like we've obviously become pretty good friends over the years, and I've wanted to bring you on the podcast for a long time, and we've sort of like danced around that in the past, but I was always like, dude, what could be less about abroad, quote unquote, than like two guys from North Carolina. So I thought I got to find, at some point I'm going to find some excuse to do that. And fortunately we just had an awesome time hanging out in Portugal together. You went on this epic trip with your family through Switzerland and off gallivanting across Europe from there. So I thought this is the time. Darren, man, welcome to About Abroad.
It's a pleasure, Chase. Thanks for having me. Look, all roads lead to North Carolina. So we'll welcome any listeners when they come around these parts. Barbecue and sweet tea is on us, right?
Absolutely. North Carolina is one of those places that falls off the radar, I think, in terms of like, you know, if you're going to the US for the first time, you're not gonna maybe put North Carolina on your map. But you and I are big fans of the state. I just returned from there. I spent some time back after running remote, went back there and like sometimes just marvel at the beauty. I'm like, this is a beautiful part of the country. So, you know, put it on the radar, guys.
I like to say that I love to go, but I love to come home. And I think if you ever hit that balance, you're doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. Could not agree more. So I wanted to kick things off with a little bit of a review of running remote, because I think we both walked away from this year's conference. First of all, it's in an amazing place in Lisbon, Portugal, which had you spent much time there before this trip?
Never been to Lisbon before this trip.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. We had touched on that when we were there. So first of all, I mean, I'm just kind of curious, like I would love to hear your big high level thoughts leaving the conference itself, the event, and then also like I'm kind of curious to hear about your impressions of Portugal and Lisbon in particular, because it's one of my favorite cities in the world, and it's a place we talk about a lot on this show because Portugal is currently ranked the number one country in the world to move to. For expats. Lisbon is the epicenter of that conversation. So there's a lot to like, a lot to love, and it's very attractive. It's a popular place to talk about from the global mobility standpoint. So anyway, let's start with running remote, and then we'll migrate into that.
Running remote. All right. Key takeaways here. Lisbon was amazing. It's really important to have in-person events on the schedule. You wouldn't think that a bunch of remote advocates would like spending time together. After all, we're remote. But it turns out it's exactly the opposite. And it really reinforced how important intentional in-person gatherings are, especially in remote companies, but really in any organization. Getting people together to learn and to have fun and to bond and break bread is really important. And a great destination really helps. I found Portugal as a whole to be incredibly family friendly. This was echoed by people who had moved there from other parts of the world. So kudos to the Running Remote team for picking an awesome destination for that. Destinations matter, venues matter, experiences matter. And really what this was an experience wrapped around learning and bonding. Key takeaways from the event itself: we've won. Remote work has won. I think a lot of us have been, who have been in the space, are a bit exhausted from flying the flag really high over the past few years. And I think it's okay for us to take the W. The truth is, a third lane has emerged, and it is a meaningful lane that's being developed, but it's there. And it didn't used to exist. Now it exists, and there's a third lane for people to work in. The rest of the world is figuring out which lane they want to sit in. I think that's totally fine and healthy, but it feels good to have a real meaningful third option. I think where we go from here is get back to winning. I see a lot of organizations that are debating where they want to be on the distributed spectrum, and they have questions around culture and connection. And the best way we can influence that is to go back to our organizations and do awesome things in those fields, and do it in an open and transparent way, so that we lean into the show, don't tell mechanism of leadership. And we'll start showing the way, and other organizations will be attracted to that. It becomes magnetic. And so my hope for the next year, until we meet again at Running Remote, is that a lot of leaders that believe in this go back to just doing the great work and showing it. And other organizations are looking for this, so they'll find us. And I think that's how we can create lots of leverage in changing the world. And the last thing I'll say is that I continue to believe that this community of people is a community of generous, insightful people. They're open by default. I think that we should continue to lean into that. The world needs this more than ever. And I'll give you some added context. The week after Running Remote, I went to Geneva and spent a few days at the World Economic Forum Growth Summit, where the topic was, quote, jobs and opportunities for all. It's hard to imagine a more effective, efficient, inclusive way to achieve jobs and opportunity for all than by effective, inclusive, global work. And it was amazing to have those back to back. And so from the WEF stage, I saw a global footprint of leaders that are thinking much bigger than remote itself. Yet global work was really a through line into every conversation that was had there. And so Running Remote was this awesome kind of micro conference where all the change is really happening. And then the next week, I saw a huge macro lens where it's happening, but there's so much more education that needs to be done. A lot of people don't know what they don't know. So it's on us to keep winning and showing the way.
It's an interesting point you make right there about the micro versus the macro, because I sometimes have this thought that we're in this little bubble, this remote work echo chamber, where people that have been pushing for this for a long time and working on making it happen at scale, which, you are one of those voices that's at the very top of that list. So this better than anyone. I think that we do live in that echo chamber in a lot of ways. And obviously that echo chamber has been broadened. There's more people that are at least peering into that conversation from outside and partaking in it in whatever way they want to, and then implementing what they can into their organizations. What's interesting is when you step outside that bubble a little bit, and I experienced this, I think, more last year at Running Remote in Montreal than this year. But there is this, when you talk to people who are looking at it from a more macro standpoint, from a higher level, that haven't been living in this world that we have for a long time, there is still a disconnect as to how to implement some of the things that we talk about every single day in a more global way, in a bigger scale. And so the juxtaposition of those two events happening within a week of each other, being at Running Remote, literally the world's largest conference about remote work, where all the thought leaders in that space are gathered in one place, and then going to a place where they're talking about much bigger issues on a broader scale, talking literally the World Economic Forum, talking about these same subjects, but through a totally different lens. I can imagine that the dichotomy there had to be more prevalent than ever.
Yeah. And look, I try to look at everything through the lens of opportunity over fear. And so what I see in terms of opportunity is we have to think much bigger about remote, and we have to start changing the language, because what I'm seeing is global leaders care about macro metrics. And when they hear the word remote or distributed work, to them it sounds like something niche, something small, perhaps a perk, perhaps a policy. But what it actually is a business model. It's an operating model. And I think it would behoove those who are in the space to start thinking about it that way and talking to leaders and bringing solutions to major problems in terms of upskilling workforces, maintaining culture and connection, enabling financial officers to have more disposable income to invest on their people. That's what great remote practices can bring. And so we've achieved phase one. Let's move to phase two, where we truly look at it as an operating model and start having conversations at a bigger level.
Mm-hmm. What was your role there at the World Economic Forum event?
It was really to learn and to listen and to plug into a few of the communities that were assembled there, particularly the unicorn innovators community. So there's a curated community of unicorn startups that are at the forefront of changing the way society works and making a positive impact in society. And it was amazing to be around a group of thinkers who, by and large, have no ceiling. One of the takeaways I had is a lot of people have found success globally, mostly because of their attitude. They just believe there is no ceiling. They believe the world is inherently dynamic. And even if they can't change it themselves, they believe that there is a combination of private or private-public partnerships. You can get the right people around the right table to get the ball rolling. And there was one gentleman, the thing that I will take away from that conference more than any other, there was one gentleman in this community, and he had been plugged into the World Economic Forum around 2 decades. He worked there for 4 years before going on to found a company. And he said the conversation 10 to 15 years ago would have mostly been around, how can we one up our competitors? How can we be slightly sharper, edgier? Where's the competitive advantage? Today, the conversation is all around, how can we open, collaborate, partner with other entities around the world to solve challenges much bigger than ourselves, but are key to solving if we want our businesses to thrive. That is a massive mindset shift that was incredibly encouraging against the backdrop of the global news narrative, which is actually quite dystopian at the moment. But what's actually happening is that collaboration and partnership is at the forefront of everyone's mind, because they recognize now that unity is the only way we're going to make progress going forward. It was so refreshing to hear that. And this person was in a position of authority to be able to say that. He has the legacy to have that context. That is very powerful. And I share that with this audience because through the lens of remote work, we have to also look at it through the lens of unity. How can we meet the rest of the world where they're at? How can the running remote community embed itself into other communities that are broader and bring what we have into those communities while also learning, creating a positive learning loop there? So that's the main thing I'll take away, is that collaboration and partnership is at the forefront of world leaders' minds. We should leverage that opportunity.
I think it's one of the things that I have been most attracted to in the whole remote work community in general, is this whole build in public mindset, and how much almost everyone I know in the space views this in the same way that you just said about unity versus competition. Like, we don't see it as I don't need to create the best handbook out there to one up GitLab and what Darren did at GitLab. I want to take and learn from what you've built in public and then improve on whatever I can internally and share that publicly, and hope that that helps someone else in the same way that you guys did with that initiative. And that is kind of like just one example of how I feel everybody is approaching this. And so I find it really interesting and fascinating. Like, not only am I just personally attracted to that way of working and always have been, but I also find it really interesting because I think a lot of people want to put this narrative around remote work that it's sort of like a selfish thing. It's like, you want it for you. You want it so you can have your own, so you can work from home, and then you're going to isolate yourself and you're going to be disconnected socially from your coworkers and colleagues. And there's not going to be this sense of connection. But in fact, I find that it's like more connecting. Like, I feel more connected to people that I've met through this community and through my colleagues at work than I would if we worked in the same place together. And so I just find it interesting how, like, that's one little example of a much bigger conversation. And that conversation is literally being had at the top of the pyramid when you're talking about the World Economic Forum. So that's really fascinating to me.
We can learn a lot from where we've been. I look back at something, what's the BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal. You turn back the hands of time, you think about the space race. Like, how audacious is it that we can send humans into space? And it actually started mostly from a competitive spirit. Which nation can get there first? But look where it actually ended up. It's one of the most unifying things the world has ever seen. Nations that don't even get along with each other from a baseline political lens work together on the International Space Station. We are now in agreement that this is way too big for one nation to take on alone. And I just think there's a lot to be learned in that. Like, it's crazy to send people to space. We need everyone. We need the learnings from everyone. It's crazy to think about rewriting, re-architecting the organizational script on how people work. We need as many people as we possibly can. So I don't know if I'd go so far as to say this is the next space race or the next space endeavor, but we can learn a lot from the unity that comes from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the analogy. I'm actually a total nerd. Like, I'm an analogy nerd or metaphor nerd. I use them, like, I probably overuse them. My wife cracks up. She's like, did you really need to make an analogy for that? I'm like, yeah, I did. It's how I roll.
Yeah. When I go to restaurants, I order meals on analogy and just see how good they are.
Yes. Well, with that in mind, one of the things that I loved, like one of my key takeaways from running remote was Ryan's opening speech, the opening keynote that he gave, and his analogy about how
Ryan Chartman from X Team, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. He just did a fantastic job drawing this amazing analogy between where we are today and the chaos that is what we have in terms of remote work and all the opportunity ahead of us that I think is the more impactful part. But comparing that to when the automobile was introduced, and how there were no lanes, there were no gas stations, there were no Jiffy Lubes to go get your oil changed, or traffic lights or laws. He had this amazing video of, like, when the automobiles first introduced, on the same road as a guide riding a horse, a tram coming, people crossing the road, all the chaos that ensued there. But then eventually where we get to is this network of superhighways and gas stations at every exit and DMVs, and like everything, all the infrastructure that came afterwards that makes it so feasible to, one, own a car, use it, and then all the doors that unlocked, like the trickle down effects of that, people being able to live outside the city and commute in, or find economic opportunity on the other side of the country and travel there, like everything that came from that. And so seeing it as, and I think the reason that the chaos thing is so important is because we do still have, although we've got the W, I agree with you, like we've arrived to that point. There is still a headline being spun out there that says, the return to office mandates are coming, everybody back in the office, you can't stay connected to your teammates, productivity's dipping. Those tales are being spun as well. And so seeing it as, okay, yeah, you want to throw that in there, that's fine. But there may be some chaos, but look at all this opportunity that's ahead of us. And now we get to build the infrastructure, or build upon the infrastructure that we have already. That was really cool for me and very impactful.
Yeah, love that. Nothing additional to add there other than we're at a time of building infrastructure. So lean as heavily as you can into helping build that infrastructure. And also keep an eye out on the smaller companies that are being born from 2020 onward. it's interesting to think that the bulk of this change may actually come from the smaller organizations that were born into this compared to the larger legacy organizations where the transformation will inherently take more time. Pay attention to both of those. These giant legacy organizations get a lot of the headlines, but oftentimes those overnight success stories, the change is actually happening while no one's looking. And then suddenly it happens. I think OpenAI is a great example of this. The team has been working on that for years, but most of the world thinks that this just happened. And so pay attention to the builders, big or small.
Yeah, dude, how wild is that? I mean, we don't need to go down the AI rabbit hole today, but like we were talking about AI for like 10 years and then all of a sudden on Tuesday, it just arrived. Like it's just like, oh yeah, by the way, yeah, but we all have AI now. Like, what? I thought that was coming. We've been talking about it for a while, but no, it's here.
Yeah, it's here. It's here. Remote work, yeah. I mean, it's a product, it's a technology, so it's going to follow a similar curve.
Yeah. Well, one of the, this about me, and it's something I think people know about you. But one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on the show is, like travel, the show is called About Abroad. We focus on a slightly different narrative than just pure remote work sometimes. And people know you as the oracle of remote work. They know you as the guy that wrote the GitLab handbook, but there's this chapter or chapters of your life before that are all very closely connected to the work that you do today, but from a slightly different angle. And it's the exact same reason that I started this podcast. It's a side hustle for a reason, right? It's something adjacent to my core day-to-day work, but it lets me express and talk about another side of my life that's connected, but not exactly the same. And that is the world of global mobility, travel, exploration. And remote work unlocks that a lot. And it's not the reason that I'm passionate about remote work today, but it's also one of the reasons that I was originally interested in location independence and being able to have an income that came in from abroad, so I could keep traveling and live in different countries and immerse myself in other languages and all of that. So anyway, I happen to know this is a part of your tale as well, but I think that there might be some people out there that don't know this part of you. And I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, and there's this interesting line in here for when you worked at the Points Guy, TPG, where having explored all 50 US states, nearly 50 countries, and countless national parks across the world, I'm passionate about experiencing new cultures and immersing myself in places unknown while leveraging TPG's global platform to enable as many of my fellow global citizens as possible to do likewise. That kind of like encapsulates everything that I'm passionate about with this podcast. So I wanted to dive into this aspect of your life a bit.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that quote back up. It's still as true today as it was when I wrote it. Let me give you some background. I'll start by sharing my identity stack. So I'm an adoptive father. I'm a man of faith and community. I'm a traveler. I'm a Delta Million Miler. I'm a Guinness World Record holder. There's a few more of those. But the reality is that remote work was the best mechanism for me to live out that identity stack. And when I think back to where this really all began for me, I'll position it against the backdrop of what I think most people do, which is at some stage in your life, you decide what you want to be when you grow up. And then without thinking of it, you let an HR team tell you where you're going to uproot your family and move to in order to be that thing you wanted to be when you grew up. And this notion never made sense to me. I could never quite square it with the reality that I wanted to have. And I just fundamentally believe that we as mankind, as humankind, were destined for something bigger and greater than that. So those were the theses that I operated on. So I said, okay, if that's the theses I operate on, how can I do this in a way that's more meaningful to me? And so what I did is exactly the opposite. I optimized for the lifestyle I wanted to live, which predominantly involved traveling and seeing and experiencing as much as I possibly could to maintain a growth mindset. And then finding employers or partners that were progressive enough to let me plug in that what was at the time very unorthodox way of doing things, but still move their business forward. And it was not easy. This has become much easier post-COVID, but pre-COVID, this was very much rolling a boulder straight up a mountain. This was very difficult to achieve. But I'm very grateful for those opportunities because they shaped who I am today. And I mentioned at the top that I'm an adoptive father. After many years of traveling around the world, what my wife and I began to see was that there's a great need. There's an orphan crisis. There are children and really people all over the world that need homes, they need friends, they need love. And at some point, it just clicked for us that if we were ever going to expand our family, it should be through adoption. We have the home, we have the love, we have the family, we have the network, we have the community, and we have this great privilege of being able to call home a place that is meaningful to us, and we have this incredible network of support around us in the local community. And so what began as Darren's personal interest in travel really unfolded into, well, this is a meaningful way to design your life to make a meaningful impact on someone else's life. And we adopted our son at birth just over 4 years ago now. And it's been the most beautiful, transformative experience of our lives. And I look back at that and think so much of it was made simple because of workplace flexibility. And it's now my personal mission to make sure that I'm not the exception, but I'm the norm. If we do this right, people will just take this for granted. It will just be so common that, of course, you can foster or adopt. Of course, there's no workplace rigidity if you work in the knowledge space and you work a digital role. We're a long ways from that reality, but I keep focused on that definition of success. And my hope is that by sharing that, we open hearts and minds one at a time.
Yeah, I think you do. I mean, I just, some outside perspective. I think you sharing that story in different formats and, and when the opportunity arises, when you get the chance to weave that in to the story about your work and your life, I think it is impactful. And that's what I find really fascinating. It's one of my favorite things about doing this podcast is I get to talk to people like yourself that have built amazing lives for themselves. Let's say that in the intro to the show, like we're going to bring on people who have built amazing lives for themselves. And that comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes. But the red thread that unites most of those stories there's two actually I would reflect on. One is they've found some way to access freedom, flexibility, location independence being at the top of that in that method or in that manner. And the other is they have often not taken a linear path to arrive to that point. And we are sort of taught from a very early age that life is going to be very linear. Like the cliche, stereotypical way that you would describe that is like, you're going to graduate from college, you're going to get a job, you're going to buy a house, you're going to have a family, you're going to work for 40 years, and you're going to retire and die in that same place. And obviously, like it's not anything super novel or revolutionary at this point to say, oh, it doesn't have to be that way. You can live a more fulfilling life if you choose to. If that's the life you want to choose, that's great. But people that come on this show have built an amazing life for themselves. They wrote their own narrative, and often almost always it's not this linear path. They've woven this tale in their own unique way, and they've taken 2 steps back to take 3 steps forward. And they've gone on, they worked at the Points guy, and then they ended up working at a tech company, and then they've ended up becoming a VP of workplace design. Those dots would not be, you wouldn't have written it out that way if you started from the beginning. And I find that really, really interesting.
Man, you're so right. And I'm laughing as you say that, because I think the most interesting people in the world have very circuitous paths. That's what keeps it interesting. And I think it's also worth pointing out that even that kind of linear path that you laid out, we come from a great place of privilege. There are many people in the world that couldn't even get to that first step of having access to a university. And so I try to keep all of that in check. And the more you travel, the more you see that. And I look at what's possible through remote work when you're able to bring opportunities to more places. It might not solve the whole thing, but it is getting closer to solving it than any other revolution that I've seen to date. And so it matters for I think, the audience that would listen to this podcast, but it also matters to the people who might not even have access yet to the technology to listen to this podcast. And that for me is really what drives me. It's so much bigger than us.
We'll be right back to the show after a quick break for a note from our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by my good friends over at Greenback Tax, the very best in U.S. expat tax services and the company that I've trusted to handle my tax situation since I moved abroad in 2015. Greenback is 100% focused on helping U.S. expats with their taxes, and to date, they've filed almost 50,000 returns for nearly 15,000 happy customers like me living in more than 200 different countries around the world. After 7 years working together, I can say with confidence that they make one of the most painful parts of life abroad an absolute breeze with their automated systems that store all of your information for you to make tax filing easy year after year, and the friendly advisors who you actually have a working relationship with. There are no robots over at Greenback. Best of all, everyone is a CPA or enrolled agent with a specialty in U.S. expat taxes, which means they know exactly how to help you take advantage of some incredible tax breaks because you're living abroad, not in spite of it. As of January 23rd, tax season has officially arrived, so it's time to get started. Learn more about Greenback Tax today by visiting greenbacktaxservices.com via the link in the show notes. Hey guys, if you're still around and enjoying this episode, then I think you might actually like our once a month newsletter as well. If you'd like to sign up, just open up the show notes of the episode you're currently listening to, scroll down, and look for aboutabroad.com/newsletter. It takes about 30 seconds to sign up. It's a fantastic way to support the show, and I think you'll be pleased with the information that we provide every month as well. Thanks a lot for listening. Hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. I wrote this article a year or so ago for our friend, our mutual friend, Jesse at Workforce, and then ended up getting published in a few other places. And it was all about how remote work can be a force for good and connecting it to the UN's sustainability goals. So like for anybody that's unfamiliar, there's like the United Nations came up with 17 sustainability goals. Like if we want to have a sustainable planet, these are the 17 things we need to do as a global community. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, like the idea that you can connect the whole world around a set of initiatives is a really cool thing. And it's sort of enabled by the remote work practices that we talk about a lot. But diving into it from that perspective and thinking not, and when we say sustainability, I think the mind automatically goes to like, environmental sustainability. How do we help our oceans and how do we prevent climate disaster, and those are part of it. But a sustainable planet also involves moving everybody above the poverty line, and making sure that everyone has access to education, making sure that gender rights are enforced, and that there are no a less of a wealth pay gap and things like this. Like there's so many elements that go into it. And so anyway, I find it really interesting because you can connect a lot of those initiatives directly to remote work and see how you can unite those concepts to have a more sustainable planet. So anyway, we'll drop the link to that in the show notes. But I find that really interesting. Like we can connect those dots.
I appreciate that. I want to mention one more note on that, and then I want to talk about parenting and traveling and the differences I've seen, if that's cool with you. One of the other sessions at the World Economic Forum was on the S in ESG. So if you're not familiar with ESG, it's environmental, social, and governance. And the thesis of the group was it's really easy to put metrics on environmental. How are people, teams, organizations impacting the environment based on the organizational design decisions that they make? But the S is much squishier. How do you put metrics around social? How do we measure the impact on that? And it was amazing to watch the group coming from the perspective, not from the world of remote work, trying to wrap their heads around this. And when I saw this question, I thought, oh, well, if you build a global team and you have people in 60 plus countries, it's quite easy to quantify the economic impact for each of those communities around the world compared to forcing all of them to leave those communities, uproot to one place where most of them may not even want to be. We can measure that. And it was a bit of an epiphany in the room. And what it showed me was some of the things that we in the remote community take for granted. These things are just second nature to us, are actually groundbreaking revelations to the broader world. And so I would issue this as a call to action to not just tuck those away as understood globally. This is going to be part of the bigger education process. Some of the things that are second nature to us are very new revelations to the rest of the world. So I'll share that on the social front. If your organization is tackling ESG, that's an opportunity for you. All right, man, you want to talk about parenting and travel?
Yeah, I do. One last thing I want to add to that, because then I'm excited to dive into that as well. There's a couple. There's like these second and third order effects, right? Like one thing is very obvious is with you open up global work and you can start hiring people in developing countries, and the stimulation that can cause for the economy. That I feel like is fairly obvious and exciting in and of itself. It's already added hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to nations that otherwise would not have access to that work. But what I think is really cool are, for example, the way that can change the outlook on life for individuals, on their expectations for what is possible. When you grew up thinking that your ceiling was X and now it's 10X of that is the changes that makes on an individual, on a family level are mind blowing. And so I'm really excited about the economic impact that we can have from that standpoint, but then also like what it does for people's psyche and what they believe that their new ceiling can be. And then also I think it creates this more empathetic global environment where, for example, you have people working in countries that you otherwise would not normally have any contact with, and getting a glimpse into what their day-to-day life is like, and vice versa. It unites us in a different way. And I had someone bring this up. If you have people right now who are on both sides, you have coworkers who live in Russia and the Ukraine, for example, you have a totally different empathy for both those people going through whatever it is that they're going through. And having those conversations with people on both sides of that war, you feel very differently than you would if you just saw the headlines on the news. So these are very positive things that can take place as we start to connect more globally.
Amen to that.
Yeah. Okay. So off my soapbox, you are willing to share a bit about traveling with a growing family, which I imagine is different than your younger years when you were, traveling around the world with TPG. And I'm also interested to hear a little bit about that. Maybe you could give us some context from your previous experience graduating into where you are now as a global traveler.
Yeah. Can I tell you one of my favorite travel stories back in the TPG days?
Yeah, please.
So look, I'm a points and miles hound, right? If you don't know what points and miles are, search for it. Go to TPG. Love the team there. They do amazing work enabling people to leverage points and miles to experience things they otherwise could not.
This would be like credit card points, miles through the airline programs, stuff like that. And you mentioned, you threw this out there earlier, but maybe I'm curious to hear a little bit more. You mentioned you're a million miler.
I am. So that means I have flown over 1 million miles on Delta Airlines. So Delta is my carrier of choice. I have a few miles here and there on other airlines. I'll fly them if I must, but I am a Delta loyalist. While we're on the topic, I'll give you the story of why. And this is also a good story for marketers and customer success folks who may be listening on why experience matters and how one thing can make or break a lifelong customer. So I fell in love with Delta mostly because their people care. I always just, whenever I fly Delta, I feel like the people that are working at Delta really care. And that matters a lot to me, and that you don't find that everywhere. So my wife and I are in Peru. This was a number of years ago. We're going to go to Machu Picchu, which, if it's on your list, keep it on your list. It's an amazing place to go. So we did Machu Picchu. We're flying back home, and this freak snowstorm overtakes Atlanta, which is the global hub of Delta Airlines. So at the time, Delta only flew one flight per day in and out of Lima, Peru, and it was to Atlanta. And I saw that the ice storm had basically shut down the airport for 2 days. And so they had canceled my flight as well as the next day's flight from Lima back to Atlanta. And I was like, oh no, this isn't going to work well with the schedule. I need to be back home. So I phone up Delta, and what I just love about the story is I remember I was in this like ragtag taxi cab in the back seat. It was hot, had the window rolled down. It was super noisy. And this was before the days of easy international roaming. These were the days where if you turned international roaming on in your phone, it was like $4,000 a minute or a megabyte or something outrageous. And so what I did is I had picked up a hotspot, a local Peruvian hotspot, had the hotspot literally in my arm, stuck out the window like an antenna sticking out into the air, and then had tethered my phone to this hotspot. And I'm trying to call Delta's number to ask them what my options are. And I managed to get through. It's very like the signal is terrible, but I managed to get through like, hey, I can't get to Lima. What can you do for me? Long story short, they put me on a flight to Miami on American Airlines that same day. They booked myself and my wife the last 2 seats on this plane. They paid a small fortune for these seats to get me back home that day. And that was the moment where I thought, all right, I'm Delta for life. You just got me home probably 72, maybe even more hours ahead of schedule. You intentionally bought tickets on a rival airline. And the fact that I was having this conversation with my arm literally as the antenna hanging out the air probably added a little bit to it. But that's the moment where I became a Delta lifer. And I've now had the privilege to meet so many folks that actually make Delta work, from designing their interiors to operating their communications to every aspect of the organization. And they truly are first-class people. So if you're listening and you work for Delta, thank you for all the times you've gotten me from point A to point B. And I hope there are a lot more of those in the future.
A million miles in. I mean, yeah, you've been around the world with that. That's an insane number. That's an incredible story, man. That will definitely earn you a lifelong customer going above and beyond like that. I feel like people don't expect that from airlines these days anymore either. Like you kind of expect a crappy experience in some way, like it's just like you're thought of as a commodity. So when you get that level of customer service, you're bought in.
Yeah. I'll tell you one more funny travel story while I'm at it. Flew to Ushuaia, the bottom of the world, on a fare sale, and hopped in a rental car there. And I'm driving to the Airbnb. It's a manual car, of course. And I get to the street that I'm on, and I want to back into the spot, kind of parallel park, right? So I drive a little bit forward to the parking spot, press the brake, press the clutch in, aim for reverse. Car will not go in reverse. I thought, I don't know how to drive this vehicle. It's not doing what I wanted. I'm yanking on it. I'm tugging on it. I'm about to rip the transmission through the floorboard. It's not working. So I said, all right, I'm just going to drive around the loop again and just angle this a little bit differently. See if I can do it. Go around the loop again. Can't do it. Go around the loop a third time. There's this person on the sidewalk that's been watching me do this. And I'm just, they're probably loving this. So they come over to me on the, I think what is the 4th try, and they kind of tap on the window. I'm like, hi, hello, hola. He's like, roll the window down. All right, roll the window down. And he just makes this, we're on audio, so I'm going to do my best to articulate it. He makes this gesture with his hand, and it's like, he's like pulling something up. He's like hoisting something up, like a crane is picking something up. And then he does this thing like a halo, a circle, pick something up. And I look at the stick on the car, and there's this halo around the boot. You have to pull the halo on the boot up, which then unlocks it to go into reverse. And anyone who's driven a car, like these cars exist. Somehow at the time, though, I had never driven one with the halo that you have to pull up. My manual back in my garage did not do that. You did not have to ask permission to go into reverse. You just put it in reverse. It was such a humbling story. Like that was my welcome to Ushuaia, is I cannot park my car to get into my lodging. But thankfully, thanks to the grace of humanity, someone saw my struggle, helped me out. And if that person is listening, God bless you. I really appreciate that.
You changed this man's life by doing that. That's the funny thing, though, about like
this was before kids, by the way. The struggle is real.
Well, that's the funny thing, man. Is like being in a foreign place. The most normal of things can be done in a way that's completely foreign to you, and it makes you feel challenged. It makes the most mundane tasks be a challenge sometimes. And that is something that a lot of explorers, people who enjoy adventuring around the world, that's something we kind of seek out, even if in the moment it can be really frustrating sometimes, and you wonder, why am I putting myself through this? It's the idea that figuring out how to park a car in a foreign place is a little bit of a challenge, and it's rewarding when you overcome the challenge, and it creates a story. When was the last time parking your car became a story? Otherwise, it's not on a random Tuesday at home. That's for sure. So I think there's something in us that craves that.
I agree with that. And through that lens of adventure, if you want to really up the ante, you say, all right, I want to build a family, and then try to do this. Thing.
Let's throw some gasoline on this fire.
Yeah,
This is getting too easy.
My wife and I were very blessed to travel for 12 years as a couple before our son joined our family. The good news there is that we had 12 years to kind of figure out travel, figure out work and travel. And of course, the better news is it's a lot easier to do that now than it was back in the day. I mean, we're definitely dating ourselves when you think about how difficult it used to be to get international roaming on your phone. I just came back from 2 weeks in Europe, and I have AT&T here in the States. And you just turn data roaming on, you pay $10 a day, and it just works. Like, man, what? How easy do folks have it now compared to when you used to land in a foreign country and you had to go hunt down a local SIM card and any number of other things? And then, of course, the generation before that had it even tougher. But the thing about integrating family into it, I would say there's a couple of tips, really a couple of mindsets you need to have. Number one is it will be different. Number two is you need to go slower, savor the slowness. And number three is drop your own expectations and inherit the expectations of the new family member. So those are the three. And I think the second one, if I could hone in on that, when I used to create trips where it would integrate work, exploration, I would have it down to the minute, like choreographed. All right, we're going to wake up at this time. I'm going to put in this much work. We're going to leave at this time. We're going to go do this hike. Based on the mileage and the elevation, it's going to take exactly this long. We're going to get back. We're going to do meal time. Then we're going to go back to work. Some days we might even do 2 or 3 hikes. Very ambitious. When it's fewer people, you can do a lot. You add a child and things slow down dramatically. There are so many more curveballs. You can't really understand when and where emotions are going to play a role in the day, when hunger is going to play a role in the day, any number of things. You also have to carry a lot more: spare clothing, toys, snacks, etc. It's a fundamentally different experience. But where I have found the most joy is saying, we're going to do one thing today. This is also a plug for a book called The One Thing. If you have not read that book as a leader, I would encourage you to read it. It really helps break the myth that multitasking is useful. When you really focus on the one thing, there's so much more clarity added to every other thing. So focusing on the one thing when you're traveling as a family, what's the one thing we can do today? A few weeks ago, we were in Lisbon for Running Remote. We had a little bit of time before the conference and after the conference. And we said, what's the one thing we're going to do today? And before the conference, we went to Cascais. Am I saying that right?
I think so. Yeah. Kaish, I think, is the ending.
Yeah. It's an amazing beach town, maybe a 30-minute train ride from Lisbon. And I think in the pre-kids days, you might think, all right, we're going to do that. And then we're going to go on a hike. And then we're going to go somewhere else. And then we're going to have dinner. Like, we're going to do 8 things today, right? With a kid, it's like, look, we're going to go to the beach. That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing.
What's the to-do list today?
That's the whole thing.
Go to the beach. That's it. No more.
I tell you what, man, we had the best time doing that. And so when you kind of just reset your expectations to, hey, we're going to do one thing and it's going to be awesome, you set yourself up for success. There's this term, I'm going to butcher this, but it's like disappointment is really the misevaluation of expectations, or the misalignment of expectations with reality. And so by resetting that, it's really helpful. And it gives you permission to slow down and savor. Kind of leads into that other point. Adults move fast. Like, when we grow up, we kind of lose that we lose so many elements of being a child, and there's just so much joy in childlike anything, childlike wonder, childlike faith. Um, the closer we can get back to that as adults, the more fulfilling life is. And so for me, it's this constant endeavor to lean into that, not away from that. And slowing down and savoring is not exactly my normal MO, but it has been a nice forcing function to really pause, really slow down, really savor. And if you're in a similar position, that's the advice I would have.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I've noticed in talking with people like yourself who are embarking on sort of a new chapter of life in this travel space or moving abroad space. You know, a lot of people I talk to have actually like made the move to live in another country, but we've all heard many times someone say, you know, oh, enjoy it. As a non-parent, I have a bit of imposter syndrome about saying this out loud. So it's nice when I kind of hear it from someone who is living that reality. But they'll say, do it before you have kids. You know, oh, enjoy it while it lasts. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. You won't be able to travel after that. But then I meet people like yourself who have said, no, it's more about realigning what your expectations for travel look like.
Can I give you 2 points? Can I give you 2 points on that?
Yeah, please.
One is that my wife and I visited all 50 US states before we had kids. And when Mav joined our life, I thought, oh, you know what would be awesome? If we reset that to 0 and we do all 50 again through the eyes of a child. And so this is what I mean by leverage the opportunity. You get to do things over again. So now I started at 0. We got to go to all 50 US states again. It's amazing. I think we're up to 20 or 21 now. The other tip I would have, if you either have a newborn or you're thinking about growing your family, travel as much as you possibly can in the first year. Now, this is just one person's perspective. You may find people that disagree with this. Take in all available data and make the decision that is best for you. But from my perspective, we went on, I think, 26 flights in the first 12 months. And what I see now, fast forward 4 years, is that it built in a level of resiliency, adaptability, and flexibility that enables Mav to be an amazing traveler because he was born into chaos. 26 flights in the first year. You never know what bed you're going to sleep in. You never know what time it is. There's benefit in not having a routine because when you think, oh, there is no routine, the default is no routine. You become a go with the flow type person. And when you're traveling and working around the world, few qualities more beneficial than go with the flow. I really am glad that we did that early on because now he's an amazing traveler. And we actually learn a lot through him looking at the world of travel through the eyes of a 4-year-old.
I love that. That was going to be the second point I was going to make was the learning to enjoy the travel through the eyes of the child. Like you see what they're experiencing and it changes what you see because you would take some of that stuff for granted. We've talked about this, before, like in off the air, and Mav's love for trains, for example, and you being in Switzerland, where like as you and I know, man, like trains just run like clockwork. I'm impressed by the train system there. I'm like, this is amazing. You see these videos of him and the smile on his face, being fascinated by the trains. You see it in a totally different way.
It gives you a new challenge, right? Like you can pull up Google Maps and search for trains, and then you just start starring places. So for a long time, I wanted to see every national park in the world. And so I would star every national park. Like, how do I engineer a trip to go to this national park? And I still want to see more of them. But now you can look at things like, where are these majestic railways or railroads? I think there's the world's longest train tunnel in the middle of Switzerland. We got to get back and do that. It's another challenge. And I think the remote community, the travel community, we love challenge. We love the exploration. We love the adventure. That's a feature, not a bug. It just gives you another layer of find what this other new person in your family loves, lean into that, and it opens up a whole new world of adventure that you may not think to do natively.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's really fun talking with you about these things because I think something you've done really well that I think a lot of people probably aspire to is you have full location independence. In theory, you could go live and work anywhere in the world that you want, but you live in Eastern North Carolina where you feel at home, where you have family, you have community. You've built a wonderful home for your child, and you have all of that. But you also have the side of you that's an explorer, an adventurer, a million miler, and you haven't had to make a trade off. You haven't given up one for the other. You've just managed to weave them together into the right output for you. And I think that's something that I'm taking from this conversation, and what I'm really learning and hearing from your story is that it's very possible to create the perfect reality for you when you're given the flexibility to craft that. And so I love what you've done in that way.
Thank you for that, brother. I appreciate it. Look, for those who are listening, if you haven't read a book called Working Backwards, you could just read the summary or read the whole book. There's a lot of power in thinking, starting with the end in mind. What is your vision for life? What is your vision for even the next couple of years? And work backwards from that. And I think there's so much power in having this notion of home attached to that. As amazing as travel is, being able to anchor to home, and look, home doesn't have to be a place. Home is where, home could be in the heart as well, but there is something special about finding home as a place. And I've actually connected with a lot of people who have explored in order to find home, and they kind of know it when they see it. That's awesome as well. And there's power in having that vision. But don't believe the narrative that you've got to be this nomadic person. You got to be able to go everywhere. Look, home is awesome. Home is important. I'm so glad we have it. It's fun to go. It's fun to come back. If you can hit that balance, I think I said it from the start, you're doing something right.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Like there's a whole Instagram world out there where you feel like you have to live up to this standard of being a perpetual traveler and always seeing the next greatest place. And I can tell you as someone who's tried to live that life, I'm at my happiest when I have my home, my routine, my community. And then I look forward to going off and seeing those places as the side dish to my life, not the main course.
Totally, man. Look, I think you should actually bake in this like small segment in this podcast on like the realities, or call it schlepping or something like that. Just on this last trip, my wife captured this awesome picture of all of us pulling all of this luggage like straight up this hill in Montreux in Switzerland, just schlepping it to the train station. It's pouring rain. We got to get to the train to get to Geneva, where the rest of work can take place. And you're right. It's not all glamorous. Everything has a trade-off. Everything has a sacrifice, but it keeps you humble. It builds character, and that's just part of it, man. It's just part of it. But it's not all unicorns and rainbows. And so we should talk more about that. Same with parenting, right? It's like one of the most humbling things about parenting is whenever you have a bone to pick with your child, the first thing you see is a direct reflection of you. And then you're like, oh man, that thing I don't like is actually me. And then there's this whole other thing, right? It's not all unicorns and rainbows. It keeps you humble, and it builds character.
And reveals the character. A little bit of both. Yeah, that's so true. And then, so those of you taking on the challenge of combining those two things are really setting yourself up for success there in the personal growth aspect of life.
Growth being the key word, man. Yeah, like no pain, no gain.
Yeah, you got to stretch to grow. So you're stretching, you're flexing those stretch muscles. Circling back to something you mentioned early on, you guys went to Cascais in outside of Lisbon, which is kind of like becoming one of those places where a lot of family friendly expats are moving to Cascais. You and I know a handful of them that live there, call that home already. We've had John Lee on the podcast, and he's talked about moving to Cascais in particular with his family, moved from Ireland down there. and you spent a day there. So I just wanted to mention real quick, like that place stood out to you. We talked about it a lot when we were in Lisbon. What was your impression of Cascais, just like for someone that was there for the first time?
The things that stood out to me, number one, incredibly family friendly. Even on a very busy day at the beach, every other person there was so accommodating to every child that was there. There's something to be said about how a territory or a nation treats the young and the elderly. Pay attention to that if you're relocating. And what I saw was this place, the people in this place were extremely respectful, accommodating, and loving to the young and the elderly. That's very powerful for me. The other thing was proximity to a major center with the feeling of being nowhere near it. So it dawned on me that if you call this home, you have the airport in Lisbon to easily connect you to anywhere in the world, but you feel a million miles away from it. And that's hard to find. In many cases, you truly do have to be a long way from civilization to get the feeling of being a long way from civilization. So whenever you can find that feeling while being close enough to those things that you don't need all the time, but when you need them, you're really glad they're close by. That struck me as a major perk. And look, I'm a saltwater heart. So being near the water, being near the sand, that's a beautiful thing. And so for me, I was like, yeah, all three things. I would come and visit often.
Yeah, beautiful beaches set outside personally one of my favorite cities in the world, where you have access to everything, big international airport, thriving scene in terms of the types of people that are moving there. I mean, it's becoming a very innovative, connected socially place. So it kind of hits all the buttons for me as well. I was
also,
interested
we got
to hear your
there via
perspective.
train, so our son loved it. That doesn't hurt.
That's the cherry on top, man. Good connectivity, trains, Mav's happy, we're happy. Darren, man, this was awesome. I know we could probably sit here and talk for hours about a variety of different things, but we captured what we wanted to for this chat and got to dive into a little bit more of the side of the story that I think I know I was personally interested to learn a bit more about, and I bet others were too. So thanks. I kind of want to wrap it up by saying thank you for always being so generous with your time, with your knowledge, with your experiences, sharing that. I know myself and many others appreciate that and have grown a lot because of it. So I would be remiss not to mention that here. So thank you for that and for taking the time today, man. This was great.
It's a privilege and an honor. Godspeed, brother.
Thanks for tuning in today from wherever you are in the world. Once again, I'm Chase, and this has been another episode of About Abroad. For those of you wondering how you can best support the show, I have made it super simple for you. Just go over to the show notes of the episode that you just finished listening to and click on one of the two following links. aboutabroad.com/newsletter to get our monthly newsletter, no spam, guaranteed, or ratethispodcast.com/aboutabroad, where you can quickly and easily leave a review for the show. It's not just important to me, it also helps more wanderers just like you find us. Finally, don't forget to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and we will see you again next week. Thanks again. Hasta luego, amigos.